Hi, this is Zeb Portanova from Team Victus and VictusHealth.com. I wanted to thank everyone for listening. The theme of the Victus podcast is to live victorious. We have numerous friends, amateur athletes, professional athletes, world champion athletes, business leaders, CEOs, and public servants joining us on a regular basis and talking about the trials and successes they have had in their lives. Thank you for joining. Please visit VictusHealth.com for your healthcare needs and engage with us on Instagram and Facebook at Victus Health. Hey, welcome to the Team Victus podcast. I've got a really close friend, cool guy with a great business story and personal story on, Matti Anttila from, well, technically everybody knows him from Dixie vodka, but the parent company is called Grain and Barrel. He's the CEO of Grain and Barrel, and Matti's going to be joining us talking about his business and what he's built, his empire, if you will, over the last course of his career. So, Matti, welcome.
Thanks, Seb. Glad to be on.
Perfect. So, why don't we start off and you share a little bit about how you got into the spirits business, right? Tell your story of how, because it's a unique path that you ended up taking to kind of get to this point where you are right now. And it started with banking, if I recall correctly. Is that right?
Yeah, correct. Yeah, after college, so I grew up out in California and then went to school in Massachusetts. And growing up, thought I wanted to be a banker. I think it's kind of a product of watching Wall Street too many times as a kid.
You mean the movie Wall Street?
Great movie. So in college I did, I interned on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange. I was in the M&A group at Morgan Stanley. I did merger arbitrage. I did, everything kind of pointing me in a direction of finance and, specifically, post-college investment banking. So after I graduated, I went to work for JP Morgan. I was in the natural resources group.
Was it a big change? I mean, going from California to the East Coast, specifically the Northeast, you knew what you were getting into when you made that change, that switch?
Yeah, well, so my father's from Finland. My mother was born in Mobile, Alabama. She moved to California when she was quite small. But I'd spent, kind of every summer growing up in Europe and traveled a lot and had some family on the East Coast. And so I'd spent enough time outside of California to one, realize there was more to the world than just California. And, really wanted to get out and experience something different. I basically picked the exact opposite of, what my high school experience had been in Santa Barbara and going to a small, liberal arts school in Massachusetts and Amherst College. And, it was there was a little bit of an adjustment from a weather standpoint. I spent plenty of time in cold weather, but it was mostly to ski.
Yeah, that's right.
So a little bit different when you have to wake up in the morning to go to class and, it's snowing and freezing. But it was good. And I ended up, every summer of college, I stayed on the East Coast, and it was basically a foregone conclusion that I would stay on the East Coast, post college. And so, it was just kind of a path that I'd been on for a while. And so I was pretty sure about kind of geographically. And I thought, from an industry standpoint, I knew what I wanted to do. And so I graduated in June of 2001. So I started at JP Morgan right before 9/11 in New York.
Oh, wow.
I had been working. I was so eager to get into the next phase of my life that I started work, I think, a week after I graduated. So instead of taking the summer off and traveling around and having fun, I decided to just throw myself into banking. So I was actually working for maybe 3 months before I was even scheduled to be in analyst training. Which I was doing while staffed on deals. And in hindsight, I wish I had taken the summer off and had fun. But it was an interesting time to get into banking, particularly with what happened on September 11th.
Were you in New York when that was? Oh, man.
Yeah, so I was in Midtown, and we were actually working on a transaction with a German company, and so I was in the office quite early, and so I remember very distinctly how everything went down, and then kind of the whole environment in New York after that, and knew a couple people who unfortunately lost their lives that day. But it was a unique situation, to say the least, to be in New York during from a business standpoint. I was lucky in that I was in the natural resources group, which continued to have a lot of deal flow even after that event. And so, while the 100-hour plus weeks of banking were grueling, at least for the most part, I was working on stuff that had a chance of being successfully executed, which made it slightly more worth it.
Yeah, interesting. Good.
And during my first year at JP Morgan, kind of towards the first year of JP Morgan, I was randomly staffed on a deal down in Brazil. So I sat next to a Brazilian, a fellow analyst who is from Rio, by the name of Felipe Bittencourt, who's now become a very successful banker in Brazil. And we became great friends. And he was staffed on an oil and gas deal down in Rio, and they needed a second analyst on the deal. And so staffer came by and kind of pointed at me. It's kind of like, you guys get along. You're going to Brazil. And from that point on, I was kind of the junior analyst on a number of Brazil deals. Didn't know Portuguese, had no connection to the country at all. It was kind of like a random selection. But I started spending time between New York and Brazil. Fell in love with Brazil. It's a lovely country, tons of opportunity, never can really get out of its own way, but really enjoyed it down there. And while
this is roughly what year was this when you were starting to go back and forth?
Like 2002.
Okay. So you're a year after starting at Morgan Stanley. Got it.
So at JP Morgan, yeah.
At JP Morgan, yep.
Yeah. So I had I was still a junior analyst. And at that time, Brazil it looked like it was actually figuring things out and was going to live up to its, the potential it's always had. As the saying is like, Brazil's always the country of the future. But they can never figure it out in the present. But so started spending a lot of time down there and discovered a couple of things. One is, I really loved Brazil. I loved the country. I felt there was so much opportunity there. Particularly at that time, you had this big transition from kind of lower income to middle income. So you had this big middle class kind of forming in Brazil. And so from a consumer product standpoint, that was a big opportunity.
Sure.
And then from a U.S. perspective, Brazil has always had very kind of idyllic imagery associated with it. It's Giselle, it's Ipanema, it's Copacabana, but very few Americans had ever gone to Brazil, right? So I felt that there was an opportunity in that to really bring Brazil to the U.S. I didn't at that point know how or what, but it was something that I'd been thinking about. So after a couple of years of banking, I did my analyst rotation. I was a first year associate. And I just decided that banking wasn't where I wanted to be long term, and I wanted to do something more tangible.
You didn't want 110-hour workdays again? Just in a different capacity, right?
Right. Well, I remember the day after I announced that I was leaving, we were working on a deal, and it was like a Saturday night at 11:30, and a VP calls me in and tries to convince me to stay. And he said all I had to do was just stick it out for a little while longer, and I could be in his position. I was like, it just does not sound.
Wait a second. So you want me to be doing deals at 11:30 on a Saturday night too? Like, and that's going to be my life?
Living the dream.
Oh man. Just let me take a tangent for a second. It's been really interesting. I've been reading about, investment banking, Goldman Sachs culture. I don't know if you've caught any of there's been some really interesting reporting from, at least from the press, on the impacts that's had on people, especially during COVID, and mental health, and kind of the pushbacks that are occurring for at least some of those entry level analysts doing 110-hour work weeks, and at least it's always been talked about. It's still being talked about. I mean, I'd be curious for your thoughts because you lived through it. I mean, is it sustainable, the model they've got built out right now? Or I don't know, just share your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I read those reports, and my first reaction is suck it up, right? I mean, it's yeah, you work really hard, right? And it's not sustainable over the long term on an individual basis, but those analyst programs just churn people, right? I mean, there's always a new class coming in, and you get worked really hard for the age you are. You're getting well compensated, and generally you don't have a lot of opportunities to go below the money. So it's decent from a comp standpoint, I think, but it's really more I wouldn't want to go live it again, but what a great training ground, right?
I mean, so cool. I mean, you probably learned so much about business and made so many global connections. I mean, this is you got into your industry because of your experience at JP Morgan, right?
Yeah, and it's hard. I mean, it's not easy work, but and colleges generally don't prepare you for that. I mean, I was an econ major in college, but it was all theoretical, right? I mean, it wasn't, none of it was like really practical for that next stage in my life. I enjoyed my college experience, and I'm thankful for it. But I had to learn everything basically from scratch when I went into that job, and I still tap into it, right? And I think it helps, just from a credibility standpoint, whether you're raising capital or building businesses, to have that as kind of the first job. And so I always tell people, if you have an opportunity to do it, go do it for a couple of years. Go live in New York City. Go experience the whole thing, and you'll know pretty quickly whether that's what you want to do for the rest of your life. I still have a lot of friends who are in it, and their roles have obviously evolved, and some of them now have big, very high level jobs in banking, and it's still a very client driven business. So you're still at the beck and call of the client, and you're getting on a plane on Sunday in the middle of the summer, and you don't really have a choice in it. So it's a particular type of person who's going to really thrive in that environment. But I think the complaining about overwork for investment banking analysts, I think is probably more representative of maybe a certain generation that isn't quite used to getting pushed that hard. So, but I listen. I wouldn't replace that experience at all, because it was foundational for my life and career. So
that's awesome.
It was tough. I didn't necessarily enjoy it while it was happening, but I appreciate it now.
Sure. You can look back. I mean, think of all you learned and all the people you met, and the foundation it created for what you've actually built, which maybe let's get back to that. So it's you put your notice in that you're going to leave JP Morgan. What year is this roughly? And where are you going at this point in your career? Have you made a very clear decision?
Yeah. So I left JP Morgan in must have been 2004, 2005. And I was exploring a couple different things. One, I was looking at potentially jumping over I was looking at some hedge fund opportunities. I was looking at real estate, which was what my family's background was in California. So like I interviewed for a job at Related as an example. I remember that interview distinctly. But I was kind of searching for what would be more engaging, but that I could use my experience, at JP Morgan. At the same time, though, I really wanted to be able to take advantage or utilize the relationships that I'd made in Brazil. And just kind of selfishly, I wanted to spend more time in Brazil because I enjoyed the country so much. And so I felt that there was a big opportunity to take something from Brazil and bring it to the United States. I looked at two categories. One was coconut water. The other was cachaça. And cachaça is the national spirit of Brazil. It's basically pure cane rum. So like say champagne that can only be made in France and be called champagne. Cachaça is the same way. So, it has to be made from freshly pressed sugarcane in Brazil to be called cachaça.
So, and back up. So I've been to Brazil. We were in Salvador and then went up to Manaus and did the whole Amazon. What I remember was, caipirinhas, of course, for the drink. But I'd never heard of cachaça before. And still as an American, had never heard of it until I met you. So it's never really broken in up here, or has it? And have I missed it?
No, I should have done coconut water. It was definitely the wrong decision from a category to hitch my wagon to. But the theory was, in Brazil, it's a huge category. Just based on Brazilian consumption alone, it's the third largest distilled spirits category in the world.
Wow.
But it's mostly industrial grade in Brazil, things that you can't pronounce that are, in a bottle that's uninteresting and that sells for, the equivalent of $1 a bottle. And so for the most part, that was what was being imported or exported to the United States. And mostly servicing kind of the expat Brazilian population, some pockets, kind of Miami, a little bit New York, and LA, in terms of more like Brazilian style or Latin style restaurants, but it was pretty minimal. It hasn't gotten bigger than that. I think there was a little bit of momentum, back in 2007 going into 2008 for the category off of a very small base, and then 2008 kind of imploded any emerging new category out there. So. But I was also in my mid-20s. I thought it would be, cool to have a spirits brand. Traveled throughout Brazil, visiting distilleries, found what we would now consider or call a craft distillery. No one was really using that term then, outside of São Paulo, in a place called Jaguariúna, beautiful countryside. And they were the first to double distill cachaça, which isn't really that innovative, but for cachaça was innovative. And so it made it, less vegetal, more smooth. And so the idea was really create a brand that was the first real super premium cachaça in the United States. And so launched that in 2006.
What was it called?
Cabana. Yep. It was a lot of fun from a marketing standpoint, huge success. Commercially less so. It was a slog, like one bar at a time.
Yeah.
No one could pronounce cachaça. No one could pronounce caipirinha. And what I realized after that period of time, it's really tough, especially in the United States, to sell something that people are afraid to pronounce, because they might mispronounce it. And with cachaça, you have a cedilla on the final C, which no one knows what to do with. It's not I
don't even know what that thing is, right? I mean, I'm going to Google it right now to find out exactly what it looks like.
Yeah. And, so that there was a lot of challenges there. And there was one primary competitor, LeBlanc, that was bought by Bacardi, and they were spending money like they were a million plus case vodka brand. And so all of a sudden there was a bit of like an arms race in cachaça, and, it just was a path to destruction. So,
I mean, I'm looking at this right now, and it's CACHACA technically. So, I mean, I would walk up and be like, "That's called cachaca."
Yeah, right. So that's a lot of the people would call it cachaca. But and then beyond that, the caipirinha is a really tough name. I mean, if you just look at it. So if you see a caipirinha on the menu now, if you're in Europe, where people speak 3, 4, 5 languages, not as big of a deal, right? People can kind of flow with different things. Here it's tougher. It's one of the problems with like Italian wine. Italian wine does not perform as well on wine lists because a lot of those names are just more challenging to pronounce. And so, it's like the little things that you learn, along the way that then, help. That's kind of like why we name the things that we name now. It's part of it is like, hey, is this easy for someone to walk up to a bar and order?
Yeah.
Right? Or is it just,
so you're at this point, I mean, you've basically created this craft brand, brought it to the US, marketed and tried to sell it, found it to be tremendously complicated. It's a either because of the name and or the positioning, if you will, and then you double down, right? At some point, you don't just say. So what happened with the Cabana brand, and then where did you go from there? Because now you've got a whole portfolio of assets.
How I built Cabana in the U.S. was through national accounts. There was basically no retail distribution for cachaça, in liquor stores. There was no volume there, so you had to do it, in very specific bars and restaurants that were featuring usually the caipirinha. Sometimes they get more creative. What I did is I said, okay, so instead of going, one bar at a time, let me kind of try and tackle things that are more of a national account basis. So we got menu placements in Morton's and Fleming's, Roy's, Hilton hotels, places like that. And what that did was it built out a national distribution footprint for the brand and for the company. Now, Morton's was not, it's great to be on the menu at Morton's, but Morton's wasn't selling a lot of caipirinhas. So, it was great. We had the distribution, we had the account placements, but still the volume wasn't enough to really, and there wasn't a path to volume enough to create a sustainable business. So what I realized, and this was in 2010, after really kind of slogging away for a while, you kind of, just hard-headed entrepreneur, like make it, until you can't. I decided that, it just was really inefficient to try and plug one small brand in an emerging category across a national distribution footprint. So I kind of tapped into my JP Morgan days and started looking at acquisitions. And was really focused on identifying tail brands within the large strategic portfolios. There had been a lot of consolidation over the past 5 to 10 years in the space amongst the large global players, and so as a result, there was pretty long brand tail. And what my goal was to identify interesting brands that were kind of lost in the mix. To extract out of those situations and really put some attention on and unlock value. And so I ended up acquiring Boodles Gin from Pernod Ricard. They had acquired that as part of, so Seagram's had been the largest spirits company in the world. That ended up getting broken apart. Part of it was sold to Pernod Ricard. Part of it became Diageo. And so Pernod, as part of their piece of the deal, got Boodles as one of the tail brands. They also had Beefeater, and they had Plymouth, and they had these other brands that were effectively or at least very similar liquid, similar price point. And Boodles, while it has great history, dates back to the 19th century, it was Winston Churchill's favorite gin, which just got zero attention. And it had been 100,000 plus case brand in the late 70s, early 80s. And by the time I bought it, it was about, call it 15,000 cases.
Wow. Okay.
And, every time a Boodles drinker would pass away, they would lose a case or two, so it was, they weren't recruiting any new fans into the franchise. So the idea was to take that and then kind of use that as kind of an anchor to create a broader portfolio around that brand. And I love the idea of taking something with real history to it and kind of resurrecting it, which is something that I've done a number of times in my career.
How did you even approach them to buy the Boodles brand? Right? Was it for sale? I mean, did you have to? What was that process like?
Yeah. So the timing was interesting because they had just bought Absolute, and they effectively top ticked imported vodka when they bought Absolute, and to pay for that, they sold Wild Turkey right before bourbon kind of was rediscovered as the quintessential American spirit. So they bought imported vodka high, sold bourbon low, and they still had a lot of debt that they needed to address. So there was a lot of shareholder pressure to get rid of non-core brands. And so they were kind of in the their mentality at that point was to be in more of a seller's mindset on things that weren't kind of core. Now Boodles was such a tiny, I mean, it had no impact on like their overall, debt or whatever, but it was kind of more, it was kind of, it would show shareholders that, hey, they were doing the right thing from a portfolio optimization standpoint. So I knew the head of sales for Pernod for North America. We had played golf together, and just great guy overall. And so I had reached out to him, and I asked, I said, do you think that there could be interest in selling Boodles? And I was having similar conversations with some other big guys. I mean, there was another brand that I was looking to buy that was a whiskey brand that's very famous, from another company, and had actually gotten pretty far down the road with them. And they would sell me the brand, but they weren't going to guarantee a long-term supply of whiskey, which makes it challenging to own and grow a whiskey brand if you don't have liquid. So, what's great about gin is, it requires no age. It's really easy to make. It's very scalable. So I wasn't as worried about the production side of that brand, and how do you put together a supply chain that can really grow it. So,
yep.
He put me in touch with their, one of their, finance guys. And that just kind of started from there. And, because of my background at JP Morgan, I didn't hire a banker. I didn't, I hired lawyers. But
you could do all of the banking side, the finance analysis on your own.
I ran the whole process myself. And, was able to acquire that brand. And then, not too long after that, was approached by another, strategic about, a potential partnership on it, and then subsequently sold the brand to them, and same thing, ran that process myself. And so, I always think back on it and say that probably, my JP Morgan education kind of paid for itself, in that transaction, but it was like my MBA, I guess. But so that's what really got me into more of a expansive mindset when it came to, the industry. And because of my experience in the cachaça space, and really understanding how challenging it was to try and build not only a brand, but a category at the same time, I really then evolved to really trying to focus on, okay, where are there opportunities within the larger categories to identify, white space and create brands to fill it. So it wasn't about, and perfect examples like Dixie, which I started in 2014. At that point, there had been this big shift from imported vodka to domestic premium, imported super premium to domestic premium, kind of post downturn. Tito's being the really the leader in that transition. And so, when I would go out and talk to people about Dixie, I wasn't having to educate them on vodka. Everyone knows what vodka is, right? What I was talking about was the rise of American vodka and this creation of this new category, and how Dixie it was becoming this kind of hyper regional brand, but a real leading and dominant brand within the Southeast, and why that mattered, and why the consumer wanted local and regional. So you're talking about kind of aspects of the trends, but you're not having to educate people on what the core product is, and that was a direct result of the challenges I saw in trying to do that with cachaça. So if you look at our portfolio now, it's why we have bourbon and gin and vodka and these categories that we didn't have to invent the category, but we can create really interesting and scalable brand propositions within them that fill a need.
Yeah, so you created Dixie from scratch. That wasn't an acquisition that you went out and somebody was sitting in their portfolio. You guys built that from the get-go, correct?
Yeah, and that came out of that was actually the story behind Dixie. Was I was on a hunting trip in North Florida with some friends, and this was in 2003. No, sorry, 2013. And we had been quail hunting in the morning, and then in the afternoon, and then we kind of had dinner, and then we went out, kind of futzing around and looking to go find some pigs and maybe raccoons. Hunt, and I ended up shooting a 350-pound boar, and this was at like 11 o'clock at night after a couple bottles of wine.
Wow.
But just trophy boar. And so we went back and we're all sitting by the fire and kind of exchanging hunting stories, and we were for the most part all drinking bourbon, but one of my friends was drinking vodka. And he was, we're kind of giving him a little bit of grief for not drinking bourbon. And he eventually he's like, well, I'd rather be drinking bourbon, but my doctor said I should be drinking, less bourbon and maybe, instead be drinking vodka, just healthier. Which, is like,
is there a doctor that would ever really say that? I've never heard such a thing.
Well,
right?
So I was like, okay, putting aside and this was this is a friend of mine who's he's a guy's guy. He owns an aggregates business. He's not walking into a bar and getting a Grey Goose martini. I mean, he's, so I was like, okay, well, putting aside a conversation about this doctor, which we might want to talk about at another point. I was like, well, what brand of vodka do you like? And he's like, well, normally or historically, I would order something Russian, right? Because it just, it's like Russian vodka. It felt kind of more manly.
Yeah.
So recently I've been drinking Tito's. And I said, oh, and this is just as Tito's was kind of emerging out of Texas.
Yep.
And so it got me thinking. I said, okay, what do you do if you're a Southern guy, who has a quack doctor who's telling you should be drinking vodka instead of bourbon? What brand would you really identify with? What brand could you call your own? And I said, Tito's was emerging at that point. I said, it's just great. But, Texas isn't really the core South, right? And what we had seen in beer in particular was people wanted to consume as close to home as possible, really support local brands. And in looking at the vodka space, particularly in the Southeast, I realized there were people who were doing craft spirits, but everyone was basically ignoring vodka. And vodka is the largest category by far in the U.S. So last year, there's probably 80 million cases of vodka sold. Second largest category is rum at 25 million cases. So you're 3 times as big as the next largest category. So I said, listen, there's an opportunity to create a vodka that really could cater to that type of consumer who wanted to consume American, ideally have it be more regional and local. And so we created the brand to feel more masculine. We really wanted to look more like a whiskey brand instead of, what was typical at that time of some of the super premium imported vodkas of more feminine looking. And really make the core base, all about, the regional, regionalness of in the ingredients and the packaging. And so that was really the start of it. And that's
awesome.
Yeah. So, and then we launched that in 2014, and it's based in Charleston, South Carolina, which, I have some family history in Charleston, and so it always been on my radar, but also, I wanted to base the brand in a place that everyone liked, and that was iconic to the South. And, I think I've only really met one person who says they don't like Charleston in the history of asking people what they think about Charleston. So in general, it's something that everyone can agree is a fantastic place to visit. And from a product origination standpoint, it's a really powerful home base, to have. And so, and that brand has grown from, just being a, quite a local brand because we just started it in Charleston in South Carolina to now it's the largest premium vodka produced in the Southeast and vodka of NASCAR. And,
so you, because you brought that up, we were going to get there eventually. Like, tell us about the NASCAR sponsorship, right? You guys have done something that's really, really unique. Especially from an outsider looking in. I mean, how did that partnership evolve and take hold? And I think you've got a race for sure, but do you have a car also at this point too?
We do. Yeah, we're all in. So we're all about racing. Yeah, so the NASCAR partnership folks had reached out to me summer of 19. Actually reached out to someone on my team first, had an initial conversation. I'd had a friend who had raced in NASCAR back in the early 2000s, and so had some connection with the sport. Never was a huge NASCAR fan growing up. I was actually more of a Formula One fan growing up. But
Very European of you.
Yes. Yeah. There aren't that many things that Finns are good at. Formula One's one of them. But obviously I knew the, cultural relevance of NASCAR, especially in the Southeast. And I knew also that it was a fit for Dixie and ultimately who the consumer for that brand, was. But, it always felt like it was just something that, the Jack Daniels and Coca-Colas of the world, got involved with, because I knew it was a very expensive sport. And so when they first reached out to someone on my team, I said, fine, meet with them, hear what they have to say. Unlikely that we do anything. And then that initial meeting came back and my employee, Zasek, said, hey, there could be something here. It'd be great if you, sit down and just kind of listen to their pitch. And so that was then in, I would say, October of 19. And I went up to their headquarters in Daytona, and they gave me this very extensive pitch that had a lot of different, synergistic parts to it all coming together. And when we got to the last slide, that was the price. It was high, but it wasn't nearly as high as I thought it would be. Now I've learned since then I probably should have brought someone who is an expert in the sport in to negotiate, some of the 5 points of the deal, because there's a lot more cost, beyond just, the contractual piece, particularly around activation and stuff like that. But, it just made sense from a brand perspective. NASCAR is a sport that was born in the South. And it over-indexes here, but it also is a very national, even international sport. And so it kind of mimicked, my long-term view of how I wanted to see Dixie evolve, right? Start in the South, but ultimately become a national and international brand. And so that's what started the journey. Initially, we were official vodka of NASCAR. And we were the race sponsor of the Dixie Vodka 400 at Homestead, Miami.
Right. Yeah.
Last year was our year one, as in NASCAR, which was a challenging year to be.
You guys picked a great year, great timing, right?
Great timing. We were the second race to get canceled due to COVID, and then rescheduled in June with no fans.
Oh my gosh.
Which it's a tough thing, when you're a vodka and you have any fans at the track to consume the vodka. And running a race in June in South Florida, which we discovered was not a great time from a weather standpoint. I think we had about 8 lightning delays. But we learned a lot, and then so we had a decision to make coming into this year, and said, okay, do we? And like everyone else who was a major sports sponsor, we had the ability to renegotiate a lot because of COVID, and get some payment relief, and then rethink how our partnership would look going forward. And we also used it as an opportunity to bring in, folks who are real pros in the sport, and to help us kind of think through and build out that vision, and really be the ones who were in between us and NASCAR, really from a negotiating standpoint, which proved really beneficial. But I always looked at it as it's like a 3-legged stool with NASCAR. You have the races and the tracks, you have the kind of governing body, and then you have the teams. And what we didn't have last year, we didn't have the team piece. And that was intentional. I didn't, one, we were spending a lot of money on the program, and adding a team piece seemed risky. But what I realized coming out of last year was the team piece really helps bring to, I think, life the sponsorship for, your everyday race fan, right? You've got the driver, the car. And so we decided to issue an RFP in November of last year to the teams to see if that was something that was workable within the budget to add that element. And we ended up doing a deal with Stewart Haas Racing, and Cole Custer, who was Rookie of the Year last year. Great kid, great racer. Just turned 23, so young guy, great ambassador for the brand. And, we have a 3-race deal with them this year. We're at Daytona Road Course. We'll be in the Nashville Cup race in June, which will be exciting, and then Martinsville at the end of the year. But in between all that, we have Cole as an ambassador and Stewart Haas as ambassador. We're not just the official vodka of Stewart Haas and Cole during those 3 races. It's year round. So it's been great to really pull it all together. And but it's a big initiative for us. And so it's, and it's still not perfect because there's still a lot of restrictions. There's still a bubble over the pits, and one of the great things about NASCAR, especially from a sponsor standpoint, is the hospitality piece. Like you take your customers down there, you interact with the drivers, you really can kind of get in it. Like that's very unlike other sports. And currently you still can't do that.
Would you any sense of when that sort of restriction is going to end up easing?
Yeah. So actually it's starting in a couple weeks in Darlington. They're going to start opening up. It's going to be very selective. And each team only gets, I think, 20, slots to have people in the pits. Everyone needs to be vaccinated. There's, it's not going to be what it would normally be, but I think it's an important first step. And then, throughout the summer, it will continue to open up. And I believe the goal is kind of late August, early September to have it fully back to normal.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah. That would coincide with the playoffs.
Are they making people do multiple COVID tests to get access in addition to their vaccination too, or?
That I don't know. I know that they just sent something around recently kind of detailing, and I think there's a call with sponsors coming up. But I know that the one thing I noticed was the vaccine requirement, which I was like, great, because I'm vaccinated. So I'm like, okay, well, check that box off. So I don't know what the rule will be on the actual testing prior.
Yeah. So totally unrelated. I got a ticket to go to the Masters, which was a couple weeks ago. And they didn't even care if you had your vaccine. They required 2 COVID tests. Both had to be negative in order to get in. One was within 72 hours notice, and the other was a blood test. It was a saliva test that you had to do within 24 hours of each point of entry. So if you had multiple tickets, you had to take multiple of these saliva tests within 24 hours under a proctor on your phone. It was like they were, and that was, they didn't even care if you had a vaccine at that point. I was pretty surprised, but that's Augusta National doing what Augusta National does best. And they were, they can because they can. So just as an aside. So look, you guys invested obviously very heavily. You like the brand and the partnerships with NASCAR. You'd shared with me, I think it might've been like last year when some of the, because the name Dixie Vodka has, strong roots to the South, when there was a lot of the, I don't know if social unrest is the right way to describe it, but you'd gotten some comments or criticism about the name and whether you guys, were kind of being pushed to change it. And I really appreciated your perspective on why you didn't. Will you share that with everybody? Because it was just a unique story of how you thought about it and what the brand stood for.
Yeah. So, from the beginning with Dixie, the goal was to highlight the South, right? So, and really how that really has been portrayed through the brand and the marketing is really through our kind of farmer partners and flavors. I mean, we do this, we've got our peach and mint and and our honey and everything sourced, here regionally. And in doing so, we've been able to tell kind of the story of the kind of the craftsman here within the region. And so that's always been a kind of a core part of the brand. It's kind of like the South of today, right? And the South of the future. And there's amazing things happening here. right? And a lot of, population growth, but, it's like the culinary epicenter of the country, in a lot of ways. And so as things started, and it was really around our rescheduled race, because that week, the NASCAR banned the Confederate flag at all NASCAR races. They had a policy previously where if you were flying a Confederate flag, they would come by with an American flag or another. There was basically a flag swap program. But this was this was in June, and so everything was kind of heightened at that point. And I think it was Bubba Wallace who really challenged NASCAR to make that change.
Right.
And, one, I came out in favor of that change. I thought, if we're trying to create a family-friendly, inclusive racing environment, probably flying the Confederate flag was not helping, create that. If you're making a statement by doing so, right? And that statement wasn't one of, let's all come together and enjoy this experience, and so, that was, I came out and I said, I support as a partner, I support that decision. And NASCAR has the right to make that decision, right? It's so, and then, and as kind of the, then the next piece of it was the Dixie Chicks, and then dropping Dixie from their name to become the Chicks.
Right.
And so that gave me an opportunity to say, come out and articulate why we were proud to be Dixie and what we felt it represented. And in a kind of nutshell, the statement was, listen, Dixie's been the singular nickname for the South for 200 years. And the story of the origin of Dixie is a really interesting one. It came out of New Orleans. It was a currency. It had a $10 note with DIX on the back, French for 10. And, back before the Civil War, the notes, you had your kind of core currency, but the value of that currency really was more based in whatever bank issued it versus what we have now, which is more of like a federal, system. So, the bank that issued that currency was a very well-respected bank in New Orleans, Citizens Bank of Louisiana. And so everyone wanted to be paid in currency from that bank. And so they called them Dixie notes. And so it was the land of the Dixieland, and then became kind of this, the nickname for the overall South. So it's kind of this neat story that has nothing to do with the Civil War.
Yeah, well, that's a great story, and I didn't know it until you shared it with me the first time we were talking about it, right? So it's a super interesting background.
Yeah, and that's why Dixie, particularly if you spent time in New Orleans, there's a lot of Dixie heritage in New Orleans, and it all ties back to that origin story. And so I said, listen, as the singular nickname for the South for 200 years, Dixie represents the South of the present at any given time. Right. So the South of today is different from the South of 1920, is the South different from the South of 1820, and will be different from the South of 2120. Right. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to highlight all the amazing things about this region today, and the artisans and the craftsmen and the people and the traditions and cultures and everything that's happening today. And as Dixie, we have a voice in doing so. There's no other single term that when you say it, everyone's like, oh, that's the South. Dixie's powerful because of that. And so it's like, hey, in that power, there's something really special depending on how you kind of highlight and what you do with it. And so I was adamant about, hey, we're proud to be Dixie. We're proud to represent the South today. And then the other piece of it is like, okay. And I had a couple of people who are like, well, you might want to change it anyway. I was like, well, what do we change it to? I mean, we can't just become vodka, right? I mean, it's not, we're not like the Dixie Chicks where you can become the Chicks.
Yeah.
And I said, and so we'd be just basically having to start from scratch, right? So we can't do that.
Yeah.
And so we pushed through. And I think around that same time as well, Dixie Beer in New Orleans, which had been around since 1909 maybe, they decided to change their name, and the backlash they got was severe. It was just, from across the board. You had people who, had generations working at the Dixie Brewery, who it was a slap in the face to them. It was and they had just brought back the brewery there. after it had been destroyed by Katrina only a couple of years ago. And as part of bringing it back, it was about the community coming together to bring this icon of New Orleans back. And you look at the videos of it, and it was, it had every race, every gender. It was just this very kind of community-based renewal kind of story. And then they just kind of, on a dime reversed that. And it really, they lost a ton of fans because of it. And I think, people were, pretty upset about it. And so what we've seen is by sticking, with the name and articulating it in the way that we have, we've had a lot of new fans come into the brand.
And I would think so too, right? For you to sit down and say, look, this is who we are and this is what we represent. And let's help give some background and authenticity and clarity on, our brand that we've created and why we've created it. I mean, I would, that resonates with me, and I would assume it resonates with a lot of consumers for the right reasons, right? And that's that became an opportunity for you to define yourselves even further.
And one of the funny parts of it too is we had a lot of people who came out thanking us for defending ourselves, because we were also kind of defending them, because there are a lot of people named Dixie. There are a lot of dogs named Dixie. There's and so it's just funny how so many people kind of came out of the woodworks and be like, thank you for defending us, the South, my name, my pet,
Yeah.
And, and I think there's just this, especially at that time, and not surprisingly, but there was so much knee-jerk reaction by companies who didn't really know how to act or react in that situation. And so there was a lot of this kind of like, oh, well, we just have to say something or do something or make these without really thinking through. And now, a lot of those companies are being, held to task, right? It's like, okay, well, you made all these bold proclamations in June of 2020. Well, what have you done since then?
What have you done since then?
So, it's given us an opportunity. I mean, listen, there's need for more diversity in the wine and spirits industry. I mean, think about bartenders, and and I've had a lot of talks with, there's a couple of great kind of influencers here in Charleston, two African-American women who call themselves the Cocktail Bandits. And they're awesome. And, we've had a chance to sit down and say, okay, well, how can we work together to, provide more opportunity, to get more, diversity within these aspects of the wine and spirit space. And I'd been working with them prior to 2020 anyway. So they were excited to engage because now all of a sudden they were like, everyone wanted to work with them.
Yeah.
But it's like, okay, well, yeah, let's work together. And I think as they look at it, it's like, hey, well, as Dixie Vodka, if you're taking a leadership position in that, then that's meaningful, right? Much more meaningful than if you're, Joe's Vodka from, West Ashley or something. So
yeah. And the fact that you've been engaging them, and it wasn't like it was, you just came to the realization that there was something that needed to be done in June of 2020. Hey, so we got a few more minutes left. Tell everybody about your new gin that you've created and what's so special about that high goal. This is a really interesting story, and how this has come about. Some of the celebrities. Awesome looking bottle, by the way. I've got one sitting on sitting on our counter, so I love it. My wife loves it too.
There we go. Yeah, it's a beautiful bottle. So after I sold Boodles, I had a non-compete in the gin space for quite a while. And so when that ended a couple years ago, I was really excited to get back into the category. Personally, gin is my favorite spirit. So it's hard to pass up a good, gin and tonic, especially when the weather starts getting warmer. And because of all the time I've spent in Europe and London in particular, I knew kind of what was happening with gin outside the United States. I really had a feeling that those trends, so gin is the fastest growing category outside the US. And especially on the super premium side. And you've got really, really cool stuff happening, in between, the UK, but also in Spain. And really, it's a global category. So my view was that would start happening in the US. Those trends would start kind of, bubbling up here, and that there was going to be an opportunity to not only have gin kind of evolve here, but evolve in an American forward way. And so what I wanted to do was I wanted to create really the first truly ultra premium American gin. There's a lot of ultra premium gins from abroad, but to do something that really reflected more of particularly from an ingredient standpoint, the things that make this country unique, and we make it in Charleston. So it's a very natural synergies to some of the stuff we've done with Dixie, in terms of the ingredient partners that we work with, and some of the farms that we source products from. So
and so your idea to do this, though, to build this brand, happened way before, for folks who were tracking what's going on in some of the in the spirits world for gin. Ryan Reynolds and Aviation Gin sold for like $1 gazillion.
Oh yeah.
And so you were, it wasn't that moment that like,
no.
You were well into this for what, years? I mean, how you had Boodles beforehand, you just were out because of non-compete. So
and usually I've found that, if you're going into a space because someone just sold a brand for, $500 million or $1 billion, you're probably a little bit behind.
Yes.
So
good business advice for just about everybody, but yes, that's right.
Right. Though hard sometimes to get ahead of some of those trends, but yeah, so it had been in the works, and it was really COVID that accelerated the project, because I had a lot of time on my hands. We had already had the conceptually done from a packaging standpoint, from an ingredient standpoint, but COVID allowed me to really sit down and refine it.
Mm-hmm.
And we had a great glass maker in Italy, who created a beautiful bottle out of recycled glass, and that was something that really evolved kind of fairly quickly before the launch of the brand, because I wasn't happy with necessarily the packaging direction. I said it needed to get better, and that kind of space allowed us to do so, and amazingly navigate supply chain in Italy during COVID, which was, I think, pretty remarkable.
Amazing.
But the other thing is that what I didn't want to do is I didn't want to just do a London dry gin and call it American, which honestly is basically what Aviation is. There's nothing necessarily different about the flavor profile. And I love a good London dry gin, but I felt like if we were going to really kind of disrupt the category here, that we need to do something different and the beauty of gin is because you're using botanicals beyond juniper, there's a lot of flexibility in what you can do. So we took Meyer lemon and mint as the two really distinct botanicals, and two things that I think really reflect the region the brand comes from, to create more of a citrus forward gin.
Yep.
It's made in small batches. We do it 3,000 bottles at a time in Charleston. It's got a connection to Polo, so the high goal as the highest level.
Yeah, for people who don't know, what's that mean?
So high goal is basically like the premier level of polo. So the best players, in polo, the highest rating you can be is a 10-goal player. And so the 10-goal players, there's very few of them. Most of them are Argentine. And that's like, because you've got low goal polo. I grew up riding. I played as when I was younger, and I played still a bit today. I'm a very low goal player, not a great player, but I have a lot of fun. But at that high goal, that's the beauty of polo, like the really amazing horses, amazing players, really fast pace. And there's this kind of lifestyle around it, right? Mm-hmm. This very kind of luxurious lifestyle, aspirational lifestyle. And just like, Ralph Lauren did, right? If you can tap into that, it's less about selling to the polo community, which is a very small community, but really using that as kind of this gateway into this broader luxury marketplace. And so I also happen to be very good friends with Nick Roldan, who's the highest ranked American polo player in the world, and is known as the face of American polo. And so I brought him in as kind of a partner on the brand, and to really be the face of it. And so reinforce kind of the connection to Polo. And it was fun because last spring, when everything was shut down for COVID, normally Nick is around the world playing, in front of Queen Elizabeth and, doing all the, really high-end Polo stuff. But he was stuck in Wellington and all the tournaments were canceled. So we would all get together in the afternoon at a friend's farm and just play pickup games of Polo.
No kidding.
And then sit around and have a couple of drinks and just hang out. And so that's when a lot of it really it was very organic, coming together. And we all decided, hey, it was Nick, myself, and another friend of ours, Diego, who's a banker in Palm Beach, but also really loves to play polo. It was kind of like our Casamigos moment, sitting around being like, hey, we should
what
do
an
this.
Awesome story. I mean, coming out of COVID too, right? When all this destruction and fear is happening all around us, and you guys have this really unique opportunity for friends to get together and everybody's got their own expertise and ability to contribute, and off comes this great brand.
Yeah, and it's been fun. I mean, the rollout's been, this is kind of our first brand rolling, like full rollout during, obviously pandemic is kind of, we're on the other side of it, but it's still affecting a lot of things from supply chain to, just access to accounts and events and stuff like that. But, we've been able to now start doing some very kind of on smaller scale introductory events to people or with people. And the reaction has been fantastic. I mean, people love the bottle, they love the product. And how we really designed it was less about trying to get the Beefeater drinker to move over to High Goal. It was, hey, we want to bring people into this category. And so my favorite thing is when I hear people say, oh, I don't really like gin, but this is amazing.
Yep. Well, it's my wife's, it's my wife's go-to drink right now. So
there you go.
You guys made something awesome.
Yeah. I apologize if needed, but no, it's a great product. It's and it's a lot of fun, and so I have high hopes for that, and it just fits really well into our portfolio.
And Matti, look, so we're up on time. I mean, I haven't even had a chance to talk about Chicken Cock. We haven't even had a chance to dive into your Endless Summer partnership, which is such a crazy, awesome story too. So we're going to have you back on to share some more.
We'll do part two.
Part two. Tell everybody, where can they go if they wanted to get access to any of your spirits? Where's the best place for them to go? Online, liquor store? Tell everybody where they can find it.
Yeah, so probably the easiest access point is just go to Grain and Barrel, spelled out GrainandBarrel.com. And then from there, you can navigate to the individual brand sites, which will have an opportunity to buy online. We can't ship everywhere, but I think we can now ship to 41 states. And then, if you live in the South, you should be able to find Dixie in every liquor store. High Goal will be, evolving, over time in terms of its distribution. And then Chicken Cock, which you had mentioned, which is this great cult bourbon brand that we own dates back to 1856. That's getting wider and wider distribution, but is also heavy e-commerce. So I would generally say start on the websites, and then, we're really upping our game on the digital side and e-commerce, which is one of the big impacts of COVID. It wasn't ever that big in spirits because it's still quite complicated from a regulatory standpoint.
Yeah.
But now it's becoming a real channel. And so that's allowed us to touch a lot more consumers than we normally would.
Oh, that's awesome. Matti, thank you for your time. We'll have you back on to tell some more of your story. Really appreciate you joining the Team Victus podcast. Stay safe. Talk to you soon.
All right.
See you in Sage Valley in a little bit.
For sure.
Take care, guys.
Cheers.